This is Crowkeeper Studios in Sacramento, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of mixing. This is very different than most other videos that you probably have seen before. I have too, and most of those videos are about tricks. They're about how to make your snare sound fat by cutting out these specific frequencies, how to get guitars to cut through the mix, all sorts of nonsense like that. And usually, a good portion of those videos, they end up coming back down to, and you can achieve this result by using this plugin. Links in the description below, and use my promo code, and save 5 or 10%, whatever. I'm not going to teach you any of that shit. I'm going to talk about the concept of mixing because that is more important to musicians who are going to be in a mix. Whether you're mixing or you're not mixing, these are kind of important fundamentals to understand what's going on, what the goal is in terms of what we're trying to achieve here, and what maybe constitutes a good mix versus a not so good mix in your opinion, or in a kind of broad general opinion. So the first thing that's a misconception is that the goal is to hear everything all at once all the time. This is not one of the goals of mixing historically, and it should not be a goal today. The issue with doing something like that is you end up having to carve instruments out to very narrow bands of frequency in an attempt to try to get everything to be heard at the same time. And it's not very productive. So you get, the bass drum is only, kind of two specific frequencies, and the bass guitar is just a frequency above or below the kick drum, and on it goes. The people are trying to slice these things up and then neatly put them together. Meanwhile, everything sounds on its own pretty thin and pretty unlike what you would consider a fairly pleasing tone. Now, sometimes this works. Many times it doesn't really work that well. There are other engineers who they just kind of let everything kind of step all over each other, which is fine as well. It's a completely different approach. It's more, I think, traditional in a sense. Before people had the ability to surgically EQ things, you didn't really have the ability like that to cut things down to just narrow bands. So the bass drum and the bass guitar would overlap. The bass and the lower end of the guitars would overlap. There would be a lot of things overlapping one another. This is more along the lines how I treat these things. It's perfectly fine if they step on top of one another. But if they do step on top of one another, then we've got to make some compromises here, because you're not going to be able to hear everything all at once, all the time, when there's bands of sound that are kind of stepping on each other's toes a bit, which is fine. You just accept it. In the same way that if we're eating pasta or something like that, you are accepting that adding some ingredient into the mix, it's a mix, adding some ingredient into the mix, some of the flavors will make it through, will cut through the mix, and some flavors won't. They'll kind of just blend in, and the overall flavor is kind of an amalgamation of all of the flavors that you're kind of throwing into the pot. And that's the way that I do mixing, and that's the way a lot of people do mixing. A lot of people do mixing that way rather than slicing them up. So let's talk about some of these concepts. Like I said, you can't hear everything at once. You've got to make some compromises. If you listen to a mix and you think it sounds pleasing, a lot of people will say, well, I can hear everything about X or Y or Z mix. So I'll play that mix and I'll take a listen to it, and I can generally hear compromises that are made. I can hear certain sounds that are substantially quieter than you would think that they would be, because otherwise they would get in the way. You know, you're listening to the cymbals, and the cymbals are very quiet. Why? Because maybe the cymbals have a quality to them that is kind of competing with the voice and competing with the upper end of the guitars. Now you've got to make a decision here. And that decision is, well, let's just turn the cymbals down. You've deemed the cymbals to be less important, and so you turn them, down. And that is a perfectly acceptable, reason to do that. There are certain things throughout the mix that you will feel the same way. This is a track that I'm working on. It is a scratch mix, so it's not a mix at all. I'm going to actually reset this entire mix. The song is not even fully tracked. I've only got a portion of vocals here, but the instrumentation is pretty close. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to press play, and I'm going to just mute everything but the guitars. As I add the bass in, there are certain qualities to the guitars that get lost. And you've got kind of two choices. Either one, you can deal with that, because if we do the reverse, the same thing is going to happen. If we listen to the bass and then bring in the guitars, certain aspects of the bass are going to get lost as well. But we shouldn't care about that exactly. We should care about how these two things come together, rather than trying to slice them up and make them fit, nice and neat, where they're not working together anymore because they're not overlapping. They are separate, and they will individually feel thin. The guitars themselves, people do this a lot. They shelve off a lot of high end, and they shelve off a lot of, low end on the guitars to try to get them in this narrow band in the middle where they sound like shit. And then with the bass, they're pushing all the bass to the lower end, or they're just pushing it above the kick drum. So they got the kick drum at the very bottom, and then they got the bass, and then they have these guitars that are shelved, and then, they start shelving off the highest frequencies of the guitars so that the cymbals can play. And everything is cut that way. I don't think that's the best. They each sound crappy on their own. Even if you were to achieve something that sounds decent, no particular instrument typically sounds all that good, rather than them sounding, kind of good all collectively. So I'm going to press play, and here we go. Here's just a simple concept. Okay, so as I add the bass guitar in, we're going to hear that some of the aspects of the guitar itself get lost. And in my opinion, that's perfectly fine. The bass is adding another quality to what I'm feeling is the overall guitar sound. And that's what I'm going for. It's going for the mix. And mind you, again, the reason why I'm talking about all this stuff is because when you're getting mixed by somebody else, your initial thought would be, can I hear more me? More me. That's what most people ask for. It's all about themselves. They don't care about anybody else. They care about the band. The band is just a means for them to be heard. That's all it is. It's just a vehicle for whatever it is that they want to put out. Whether they're a lead guitarist or a bassist or a drummer or a singer, it's always these are the guys to prop me up, and they may not even understand or think that there's some sort of incompetence about them not being heard at all times, rather than here's my dilemma in this moment in time, wherever we are within the mix, and here are the possible solutions that we can do. And ultimately what constitutes a good mix is making choices that feel good overall, making choices that feel like that was, of all the solutions that we could have done, that was one of the better ones. Now, I would say that I could even add more volume to this bass to make the guitar sound grindier. I think the guitars sound pretty good. They are recorded with an amp. I used a PV Viper, and then I used an EVH 412 cabinet. And I also boosted that with a tube screamer. And we also used the Guptec PDEQ to give it a little bit more brightness and clarity. And, so those are the guitars. And so let's listen to the bass adding into the guitars. See, now there are certain things that are missing about both of these instruments. I'll do the in reverse. So we're missing certain aspects. It's hard to put your finger on what is happening, but it is kind of easy to hear. There are certain sounds that are being blocked out by each instrument to each other. That that kind of nasally quality to the bass that's bright and grindy is masking some of those same exact frequencies on the guitar. And the same thing with the guitar. Some of its brightness, its very top end, is masking some of the stuff, that kind of sizzle that is on the bass. And same with the low mids on the guitars are kind of masking some of the stuff on the bass. It's perfectly fine. The only thing that matters is, do they sound good together? That's really the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter that they're masking each other. It's perfectly fine. Now, the same thing will go when I add these lead guitars in. Again, this is adding another level of complication here. The lead guitars are going to mask a lot of the rhythm guitars, in spite of the fact that they're two different tones, which is always the way to go. Don't use the same tone for your leads and your rhythms. It's just going to make your life hell. So don't do that. Try to use very different tones if you can, because they will naturally sit in two different areas without you having to do any weird stuff to it. You want to achieve these goals as naturally as possible. So let's take a listen here. Now I have these lead guitars engaged, and we're going to start hearing more of this masking effect. And as we add more instruments, that's what we're going to hear. And again, it's not about trying to maintain essential clarity on any given one. It's about the collective to sound together, nice. Okay, so now let's add these keys in. Same thing. It's going to add more of an ambience, as more things are adding in the same kind of frequency area. Things start becoming less defined. They start becoming more like a sauce rather than individual, aspects that we can, identify. And that should be perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with your instrument being part of the sauce, because we're tasting the whole thing. It's much better to do that than to assume that, we need to be able to sense your instrument and your instrument alone. There's stuff that's happening on the bass, particularly later in the song. Let's see here. Okay, so what you can't really hear that much is that there is the slap bass happening on the bass guitar, because all these other things are happening, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't need to chop out all of this other stuff to hear the slap on the bass. I have a choice to make. What's the more important? Is it the slap bass, or is it these other elements that are happening simultaneously? That's where you got to make a choice, and your mixing engineer is going to use his judgment, and that's what it's all about. That's the second aspect. Is you're using your judgment to solve these problems. You learn the tools, and then you use your judgment to make best use of these tools to solve the problem. The problem is I have all this stuff going on. So, let's hear just that bass again. Okay, so when we add just the guitars in, we might still be able to hear that pretty clearly, as clear as we hear it here. Oh, well, there you go. We're not hearing it. So let me play it longer. We're not hearing it as well. And again, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not about hearing everything all the time simultaneously. And there are certain things that you can do from more of a songwriting perspective to solve these problems, which may be its own video altogether. But let's play it again with all of this stuff here, and then I'm going to bring in the drums, and we'll see what impact the drums have on the collective hearing all of this stuff. Okay, so now let's bring in the drums, because we can hear that things have become from defined as I'm listening to just the bass or just the guitars to being saucy. Things have become more blended in together, more mixed together. So let's take a listen, and we'll hear it with the drums too. And I'll start further back here. Here comes the slap. what you can do in a case like this, maybe it will or it won't work, and it's perfectly fine if it doesn't. I'm just going to clip gain some of this guitar for one round, just a little bit down. Something, you probably won't notice it very much, but it may allow the bass to cut through just a little bit more. And it's fine, even if it doesn't work that well, it's perfectly fine. We're not going for a big difference here, really. It's just a hair more. And what you may not hear on a set of speakers, you may actually hear on a set of headphones. So it's perfectly fine if you don't feel like you hear it on the speakers, and then when you put on your headphones, you're like, oh, this dude is slapping, that's cool. That is part of a mix. I've heard great mixes where I've listened to the song what it feels like 100 times, and after I've heard the song 100 times and I've known of the song for like 10 years, I hear something in some circumstance that I did not hear before, some extra plucking on some guitar part, or some other layer that was there. That's okay. That's in my opinion a sign of good mixing. There's depth to explore, and that's great. See, now here's one of the things. The guitar only went down a little bit. You probably wouldn't notice it in context with the full mix once everything is kind of coming together. But I do now hear the bass being less masked so that I could hear that slap more. And in combination with whatever happens vocally here, you probably won't even notice that the guitars went down a little bit. But you may notice more that the bass guitar is slapping more. And you don't have to do it for this full length. I mean, you could do it for a small portion of it. And what you want to do is make a person's ear look for the thing you want them to hear. That's one of the other things, is when your ear is looking for it, you will find it. If you're not looking for it, that thing may be occurring the entire time, and you will completely ignore it. You don't even know that it's happening because it's not something that your brain is listening for. So if you start hearing the slap for any portion of time, you're now looking for that frequency that you hear that slap sound. And you're going to be doing that throughout whatever musical piece there is, 8 bars or 16 bars or something. So sometimes you only need to give a person a taste of what is to come, and their ear will now look for it, and that solves a lot of problems because you don't have to change dramatically these tones, these volumes, or anything like that. They're already doing it on their own by searching for it, mentally. You're hearing for it now. You're looking for it. And even when the guitars come back to their normal volume, it may now be easier to continue hearing for that plucking sound on the bass. Now, I don't need to know this for sure, but I'm almost certain that you could hear the slap much better here than whenever I first played it. You probably couldn't even hear what the slap sounded like, but you were able to hear it after you knew what to look for. Once you heard it here with the guitars just being a smidge lower, you were listening for it. Now, when the guitars came back to their normal volume, your brain is looking for the slap sound, if that's what you were listening to and you liked it. You noticed it, and then here we go, and you're still hearing it, even though it may not have been as audible before. Those are just a couple of the things there. Again, it's not about hearing everything. It is about making compromises. An experienced engineer is going to do that. They're often going to make a set of compromises. And especially this is true of an engineer similar to myself that is using real instruments. I'm using amps and cabs. I'm using no triggers, no samples on the kit. The drums are what they are. And that will present in itself new challenges, because when a person is using a sample, let's say for a snare, the rest of the track could be really thick in, let's say, the low end, mid lows, where the snare that they would normally use would lay. So what will they do in that case? They'll use a different snare sample to try to cut through the mix, something like that. Now, in real life, that doesn't happen, with a real kit. The drummer has a snare that he likes. He likes the sound of that snare. And when you're building up from the drum kit itself, the drum kit already claims its spaces first. That's the way it goes. It's the drum kit that says, I own this space, I own this space, I own this space. My cymbals, are either very chimey and glossy, or they're very, sharp in the upper mids, more metallic sounding, but not really shiny and glossy sounding. They're making their claim first. They're staking ground. And when you're using a real drum kit like this, the first answer I'd say is deal with it. That's what it's going to be. That's part of what made so many old records awesome and unique, and why so many of these older records do not sound very similar, and why so many new records do sound very similar. Is because they're constrained to these sounds that are occurring in real life, and you just have to deal with it. You just have to rock with it. If anything, at best, then you can change some tones after the fact. So if the bass guitar is, we haven't chosen the bass guitar yet, and the kick drum is, let's say, very low pitched, very, very low pitched, and it's just got thumpy, bass in like the 50 hertz or something like that. Well, now when we choose the bass, maybe we want to use something more like a Sans amp or something, the bass tones. Something that doesn't have a lot of low end, but it's got a lot of low mids. Why? Because, it's naturally not going to be competing with it, and it sounds good on its own, the way it's, the kind of EQ setup that you would find on a Sans amp. Those are one of the things. Or you just don't care, and it's perfectly fine not to care, and just let them overlap. You just turn the low end on both of them down equally, so that the collective, the total, is where you want it. You don't need to turn down the entire, you don't need to carve them out, really. So here's the drums. These are real drums, no samples, no nothing. It's just old school engineering. So I'll add the bass in to, add something to listen to for context. But we'll add the bass in. And again, we're looking for making things complementary, not trying to exclude them from one another. It's okay if the sounds that are coming from the kick drum are overlapping with the bass, as long as the total sound is not too much. It's not too bassy overall. Who cares otherwise? You can see here the bass guitar, is having some frequencies that are extending, down to 35 hertz. The biggest bump is around 48. Now I have 2 kick mics, and that is at 40, almost the same. It starts sloping down around 47. Here's the second, the outer kick mic. Maybe a little bit lower, 5 or 10 hertz lower, but either way, it's still in the same ballpark. And guess what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't fucking matter, because they sounds good together. That's the only thing we give a shit about. At the end of the day, you just give a shit does it sound good? You shouldn't care about all this bullshit. I hear it all the time. People who are they're so used to the tricks that they've learned, that they've heard that this is wrong, this is right, whatever. Just learn the tool. That's it. If you're a mixing dude, just learn the tools themselves. Learn what compression does, learn what EQ does, and sweep around and find out what you want to hear. And in my opinion, better yet, have an idea in your head where you want to take the mix in the first place before you even do anything. You've cleared the board. And with every mix, I clear the board. It's gone. And I make a decision in my head what I want to hear. You could hear the sounds in your head. And I can give you a good example of this. If you're familiar with the band Korn, you can hear Fieldy's bass tone in your head. You know what it sounds like, and because you know what it sounds like, you're already, if you were to EQ a bass, you should already kind of intuitively know where to start reaching for knobs, like which knobs to reach and what directions to push or pull those knobs, because you're hearing it in your head and you're aiming for that. You're not trying to make everything, fit each other or do any of that sort of stuff. At least not yet. You're really just aiming for, how do I replicate Fieldy's bass tone? And you start aiming for that. That's kind of one of the things that you should learn. That's one of your most important skills, is you learn the tools, and then you learn how to aim for things mentally first before you attempt to start tweaking knobs. Otherwise, you don't even know where you're going. And that's one of the other problems. One of the other problems is people have no idea what they're even going for. So they just tweak endlessly with no idea, no concept of where to go and how to work with whatever. This is one of the things I love about using real instrumentation. I don't need to make this choice. It's already been made for me. I don't need to sift through a million kick drums. I have the kick drums we got, and that's it. It doesn't fucking matter. It's just what it is. The same thing goes for the bass guitar tone. The bass guitar, it has its, character. And same when I mic'd up the amp in the cab. When I mic'd up the amp in the cab, I got the sound that came out of the amp in the cab, and that's it. There's not going to be a 3 a.m., urge to get up and, let me change the IR, let me change this, let me change that to see if it can fix the problem. Well, if you don't even know where you're aiming, you're never going to hit the target anyway. So there's that. The other part is you're saving yourself a headache. Instead you just work with what you got. And when you work with what you got, it makes life a lot easier. And also, that's where the character lies. One of the things is there's something to be said about committing to a sound. You commit to the sound and just rock with it. These guitars sound the way they do. The bass sounds the way that it does. Now I just EQ them a little bit to and balance them volume wise to make sure that they work as best as they can together. But that's an easy decision to make given the fact that I could hear in my head what I'm going for. And secondly, I already have the ingredients I have. I can't be swapping them out for other things. You just can't. They are what they are. And you make with whatever it is that you can with what you got. And that's kind of the way it should work. So I'm going to unmute all these things again and press play. And again, we'll just hear some of the results of all of these kinds of concepts, that I'm kind of throwing out there, haphazardly, but, it's still throwing it out there. Okay, so one thing I can say in this section here is we have these guitars that we're listening to with the bass, and all of this stuff sounds good. We're listening to the drums. Because I originally did the guitar and just the drums. This is the first thing that gets tracked. So here's what we hear, just that alone. And we add the bass. Okay, so as soon as I add these keys, add these the lead guitars, when I start tweaking these volumes, these two in particular, these guys and these guys here, these guys are going to compete with one another, but they're not just going to compete with one another. They're going to compete with these guys up here. This is my bread and butter, Now I've got decisions to make here. Do I want to continue to hear these things more broadly, more, do I want the song to sound more like this? Let's take these away. And hear all of that. Do you want to hear all that stuff? Or do I want to take these guys, and now this is kind of the way that these two are mixed together. They're like an ambience track. They you can hear them individually, but they're kind of blurring together. As I turn them up or down relative to these guys up here, it's gonna shift, the difference between it all sounding kind of blurred together. And again, blur is not a bad thing. It's just what it is. A sauce is a blur, and sauces are awesome. So yeah, it's not about these things being all individual. Who cares? It's just, do they sound good? But there's going to be a shift in the kind of dry aspect of that rhythm guitar and the bass kind of leading the show, and these things being very quiet, or these things being almost even in volume, or the other way around, where these things they're quite loud, and we're listening to the guitars again, and the guitars are kind of heavily masked. So now everything becomes, again, saucy. Let's hear that. So if I have it at this volume, we're hearing those drier kind of sounds of the guitar. And these volumes are just enough that you can hear them, these the keys and the lead guitar, but they're not standing out, you know. Now let's shift the volume up where they are the main focus, and everything on the rhythm guitars are going to seem substantially blurrier. And, you know, again, that's fine. It's a mixing choice, you know, whatever's clever, man. A lot of symphonic metal is mixed more this way, where these kind of auxiliary instruments, these extra instruments, are the forefront, especially, you know, and the mix gets bigger when you do this sort of thing too. That's one of the things I do kind of like about this sort of stuff, is that if the guitar volumes do not change, then the song gets temporarily bigger when these other instruments add to the final product. So, for example, we're hearing this. And I'm going to let it go all the way through so you can hear how the overall volume swells. There's nothing wrong with that. I know people are often trying to flatten everything out in usually a vain attempt to try to get everything to be heard. Well, I don't want to hear any less of one particular instrument. That's fine. It's fine for instruments to come in and out of the mix. And this is what I meant by in and out of the mix. When we hear the beginning of the song, we're hearing the bass and the two rhythm guitars very prominently relative to the drums. Like it's there. But as it gets closer to the way that we have it currently mixed, those, you know, here in the chorus, that's not going to be the case anymore. We're going to hear something completely different. So let's take a listen to that. Again, you can hear those instruments really up front and they're very clear, and that's perfectly good. That's usually what most of the rhythm guitars and the bass player would want to hear. Now, when we get up to this following part, these other instruments start taking over, and that is all right. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Rhythms take over again. So there it is. Those are some of the things that I can think of right now. It's already been a pretty long video. And, you know, more will come in play when I'm talking about vocals too. I'll have to make another video, follow-up video that's just talking about vocals, because vocals is the same thing. It presents a new challenge because vocals are typically the forefront of the music, and they are going to mask other things typically. And some mixes, the vocals are kind of buried in the mix, and some they're like really sitting on top. And as an engineer and as a band member who's being mixed by some experienced engineer, you have to realize, again, it's give and take. It's a compromise. It's compromises of the sounds that you have. You cannot really get anything out of these things that you always have. Some stuff is, when you're listening to stuff, like I said, this drum kit or this bass or these guitars, there are certain sounds you're not going to be able to get out of them because they just sound the way that they do. So mixing and trying to achieve some goal that's not realistic given the sounds that you've got to offer is like trying to make Mexican food out of Italian ingredients. It's an aimless endeavor. It's stupid. And so there it is. But when you have vocals, you're going to have a new challenge there. And that new challenge is going to be that most of the time they're up front and they are going to mask things, and you've got to decide what to mask, what not to mask, whether it's acceptable decision, and how buried the vocals are going to be in the overall final mix. And I personally don't think it's too bad if they get buried here and there. A lot of metal genres are like that. They're used to burying the vocals a bit, but it depends. And that's kind of your call to make. But at the end of the day, it's not tricks. It really isn't. It's, you learn the tools, you can hear what you're trying to aim for in your head, and you're using the best judgment that you can to make decisions. When it comes to specific tools like gates and pedals for guitars or something like that, people talk about drum gates. Like, man, just get all the drum gates, learn what each one is good at, when it's good at it, and use the right one for the job. Because trust me, not any given one is going to be the right one. And even then, don't, always have to take shit to the extreme either. Going to the extreme, let me gate it so it sounds like a sample or something like that. Stupid. It sounds like shit. Take everything and learn what you can with every tool that you have available, and make the best decisions that you can musically, to get out the best sound that you can out of it. Always take those circumstances that you have as unique, because using the same trick over and over and over is a disservice to whatever piece of music, whatever recording that you're working on. Oh, I always use this trick because it always works. Yeah, it always kind of works, but it's not always the best thing for it. So, I would really recommend against doing that. Instead, just learn the tools and use them to the best of your abilities and the best of your judgment. And hopefully, as people who are going to be in a mix, this makes it easier on the engineers who are mixing you, when you have some sort of understanding about what's happening here, what compromises are being made, and that it's not always, just incompetence or something like that, that your particular track isn't being heard 100% of the time, like as if it were soloed. It's just, you can't do it, man. You can't. So there it is, boys. Hope this helps. It's a long video, so I'm sure there was some decent information there. And until next time.